So in Blender, we're going to do something kind of different. I made this original texture in Substance Designer, but that takes kind of a long time, and I think there's a faster way as long as you have the correct reference to do this in Blender. So quickly, I'm going to go to Shift A. I'm going to go to Image, and Images is Planes. I'm going to add the texture that I had created. I'd love to provide this to you, but honestly, I want to give you a way for you to be able to make this yourself without having to spend too long messing with tile samplers in Designer. So what we'll do is actually use Blender as a substitute. We can bring this plane towards us by pressing Shift A and adding that plane. We'll add a loop cut down the middle and add a mirror modifier. I'm going to bring these 2 points in really close and then add one down the middle. I'm going to bring it out, and I might bring it lower around here. By turning clipping on, we can scale it without it detaching itself. I'll get it as close as I want. And then with this new middle cut, we slightly drag it out, and this is the one we bevel. This is the one that gives the grass a nice curve. And so because this is for texture baking purposes, we can actually subdivide this for our texture creation because we are not worried about poly count right now. Drag it down, and I'll use proportional editing after I apply the mirror modifier to just give it a nice little bend. And then by scaling it down, we could just start placing it around. I should be a little more generous to Blender novices as I am going in rock and roll mode on this, so I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to let you catch up. When I press L and I press G, L selects the whole mesh and G allows me to move it. When I press S, I'm scaling it. And by pressing S and then selecting an axis like X, I can type in a number. And when I type a number such as -1, I have flipped it on the X axis. So with this bendy grass, I wanted it to face the other way. I pressed S, X, -1. And that allowed me to rotate this with R. And I can match the curve of each blade. So there are only 3 elements when we're transforming all of these pieces in Blender. It is R for rotate, it is S for scale, and it is G for move. When I had added loop cuts, I used Control R, and when I had beveled it, I used Control B. And that should be the only modeling things that you would need to know for this video. So I'm going to add a plane and rotate it towards us. So here we have our plane and we have our grass. I'm going to go into the shading tab and see if we could find a way to match exactly what we're looking at here. I think one of the ways we could do it is by looking for RGB. Maybe we can make one pure black and set it into the surface. I press Shift A and that is where I find all my nodes. So I found RGB, and instead of working with some complex shader, I'm just plugging it directly into the output. This means that there's no lighting information and it should be completely black. We could do the same for this one. We'll give it a new material, grass, text, and again, we don't need this material, so all we need is RGB, and we'll make it pure white. Now we're reading this as a black and white texture. I can press Shift A here now and grab a camera. It looks like it's facing the direction we want, so I'm going to back it up. I'm going to look for the camera settings and find orthographic, and then I'm going to go into our scene settings, and I will set it to a texture size of 256 by 256. So I'm going to press 0, and that should take me into my camera, which it does. I can then press G to move this camera and start centering it. If I go to normal mode For the orientation, select my camera and press G and Z. I'm actually moving it back and forth, but I just realized it doesn't matter because in orthographic mode, we only need to play with the scale. We're capturing the whole thing. It looks really good and it looks just like the original texture. I can actually just click on render image and then save it, and we have our grass texture. Now we're going to use this texture to build the grass meshes themselves. So we're going to take this and then start bending it. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to hide this, just call it the texture part of it, and then hide everything. We can go to Shift A and we'll add a new plane. I'm rotating it 90 degrees on the x-axis, and then I bring it up 1 meter. That way when I press 1, which is the front view, I'm always having something above grid and looking directly at me. So for now we have an empty plane. I'm going to go back into the shading menu. I don't need that camera right now. And I'll give it a new material. We'll call it grass, sure. So if I press Shift A and add an image texture, we can look for the texture we had just created. I believe it was this one. We'll plug it into base color. And that is the appropriate one. So instead of it being in base color, I'm going to take it to the alpha channel. I'll call it non-color. And I think it's going crazy for now. Let's see what we can do. In the material settings, we can change the blend mode to alpha clip. And it actually solved all of our problems. Perfect. We can change the clip threshold in Blender for a different look. So I'll go back into layout mode, and to start it off, I'll start shaving this down. You can do it through loop cuts and you could start cutting, but one thing I like to do is to go to Tool and click on Correct Face Attributes. That way I can start moving the edges while keeping the UV intact. I'm still in normal mode, so I couldn't even control it properly. Make sure you go to Global for many of your modeling purposes. I'm going to bring it down, and I might scale it inwards as well. I think it's worth one loop cut here to extend to keep our whole texture in, and as well we could even push it a little forward to give our grass some depth. And I do kind of like that. In fact, because we're working with a low resolution texture, it's all about trade-offs. So with less texture res, I might bevel it and give it 1 or 2 more bevels. Then I might extend that a little bit just to keep our texture safe. And we're trying to go for as little empty space on these cards as possible. This seems like a good trade-off between all of those elements. I like the look of that. In fact, one in the middle, and we can start bringing these out. We'll keep this one for safekeepings. We'll duplicate it with Shift D and bring it forward. And I'm going to rotate it about 45 degrees. And I'll duplicate it and press SX-1. And then I rotate it. And then I duplicate and rotate it one more time. We're going to go with a kind of a triangle look. Start bringing them in a little bit more. I don't mind if they cross over too much. And so if we take the whole thing and then duplicate it again, but we're just looking to create an interesting pattern. So one thing I'm noticing is that our origin points are up here. So I'm going to grab all of these and bring them up in edit mode, and in object mode, bring them right back down. Ooh, but we need to make sure we do that with face attributes off, or else it'll absolutely destroy whatever we did. So with it back, now I can go to individual origins, select a couple on the outside, and we can start scaling them down just to add a little more variety. We might take the outer ones. In fact, maybe we should have more small ones than big ones. We're just experimenting here. So last thing I'm noticing is that in the center, I just want the grass to be bigger. And so on its local axis, I'll make it bigger, but then start squashing them down. That way we get some nice clumps without it overwhelming too much of the visual space. Look at that. I just deleted some and then kind of infusing these together. And it's all these happy accidents that create the best looking foliage. Like now it's uneven where it needs to be. It's tall where it needs to be. That is really cool. All we did was model a few blades, take a picture of it in black and white, and we got some free foliage. So this is all we need to get started back in Unreal. So let's get into the grass portion of this crazy stylized field. To get this guy prepped for Unreal, I'm going to move this to a collection called grass, and then I'll duplicate it, hide the original, and I'm just going to select all of these, place it exactly where I want. I might scale its median axis right here a little, and I will press Control A to apply all transforms. So you have to do that step last, or it can be kind of unforgiving. But I'm just noticing it might round out this shape if I take these as well. I'll make that really short. So with all transforms selected or applied, I can press Control J on all these meshes and we have our final grass mesh. For metadata, we'll call it SM grass. Before we go into Unreal, I'd like to make this grass a little bit more stylized. And the way to do that is to point the normals upwards so that they're always facing the camera, basically, or perpendicular to it. This makes a lot of stylized foliage really soft and fluffy. And to do that, let's go into edit mode and click on Alt-L. Yes, it is Alt-L. And we're going to just point our mouse towards the top and click it. Down here, a menu has popped up. We have target X, Y, and Z. We are going to take Z and type 1 million. Now, even though we don't see anything, it's really messed with the normals. They are all pointing upwards. I could show you that by selecting everything, going into the overlays menu, and I believe it is the edge normals. They are all facing upwards now. They look a little different too. So now we're ready to export this into Unreal. Let's go to File, Export FBX. All I'm doing is selecting Mesh and clicking Selected Objects. Then I go down to the Geometry menu, and while it's at Normals only by default, I'm going to select Face. That tends to work best for me when I'm exporting into Unreal. So only Mesh, Selected Objects, and Face. Those are the only three things I click when exporting pretty much anything into Unreal these days. So let's go ahead and click Export. So back in Unreal, I'm going to go into the Meshes menu, and I'm going to look for the folder where I had exported my FBX. Let's just drag it in there. In the Advanced section, I want to make sure Combine Meshes is combined. That's typically the only thing I look for, and I make sure that Do Not Create Material is also checked. We don't need a texture yet. Let's import it all, and we have our mesh. Now let's go into the Texture section, and let's go back to our folder. I had accidentally put it on my desktop. Don't look at pain. My pain is always greater than yours anyways. So we have our texture, we have our mesh. The next step is to create a material. We're going to call this the M grass material. And just for fun, we'll right away create a material instance for it and call it grass. That's it. Just grass. So I'm going to open up the master grass material, and what we're going to create here is a simple version of what you can see in the full course that should be coming out on Fast Track someday soon. The first thing I want to do is to access the runtime virtual texture, but we do need a sample of it. I'm going to right click it and convert it to a parameter. I'm going to call it RVT color. This is the color we technically want our grass to be. So first, let's press 3 to get a color. I'm going to make it, again, a nice warm green. What I want to do is blend between these two. So I'm going to get a linear interpolate, and I could type lerp, and it'll go straight to it. The color of the landscape is A, the tint is B. This is basically a wind texture that will pan across the scene and the landscape. And we're also going to be able to have control over the wind colors themselves. I'm not going to go too deep into the math, but just copy these nodes and you'll be good to go. We're going to get the world position, and we are going to get the X and Y. That is the view of our landscape. And typically when you're working with the world position as well as landscape coordinates, we are going to divide it by a big number and get a scalar parameter. We'll call it the wind size. And I'm going to set it to something like 5,000. And just in case, I'm going to get a component mask and just make sure that we are not messing with the Z channel at all. To make it move, we're going to add a panner, and we have access to the speed. So by holding S to add a scalar parameter, I'm going to call this one wind. Oh, let's actually call this wind color speed, because our grass will have regular wind anyways, and with some settings, we're going to want to differentiate between the two. Wind color speed, and we'll give it a speed of 0.005. Very slow for now, and we'll plug that into a texture sample. This information is basically saying you have your size of your texture as well as what it's doing, which is panning across. That we are panning the UVs across this texture. So we'll look for the wind that we made. Imagine that just moving across. Need to do too much to it other than its opacity, its strength, and we typically do that with the multiply node. So by adding another scalar, I'll say wind color amount. Plug it into here, and this will be our mask between our regular landscape colors that we want, as well as some fancy wind color flying across the top of it. But we're going to need to worry about its opacity as well. Oh, and we need to define what texture we're actually thinking of. So by clicking RBT color, we should be good to go. So it's time to go into the material itself and define what we're trying to do. We want stylized grass, and that means we need to click a couple of options. First of all, I'm going to click on blend mode, and I'm going to click masked. This means that we can have an opacity mask to our liking. We'll have an alpha channel, and just because it looks nice when I click it, I'm going to click two-sided foliage, and I'll also click two-sided here. Now the thing that ruins stylized grass is actually the ray trace shadows, so we're going to turn that off. I don't know if you knew that, but first things first is opacity. Let's get texture sample, and let's click on our grass texture. By default, we can convert it / promote it to a parameter and call it opacity texture, just in case you want to make more of these. So we'll plug it into the opacity mask. You know what, I'm now thinking, let's try to work with, sometimes you're going to work with solid foliage. So real quick, I'm going to add a static switch parameter, and I want to say, are you using an opacity map? If it's true, yeah, we want to use our texture. If it's not, we just want our opacity to be 1. And this is really useful for the grass that you see in Breath of the Wild and Genshin Impact. But if you want to use this stylized texture, we'll make sure that it's on by default and we're getting that awesome alpha map. Now to get our wind, we're going to look at the world position offset, and we're going to do something simple with simple grass wind. And we're not going to do anything too complicated, but I want to get the texture coordinate of our grass, and I want to mask the Y channel. We're just making sure that in this texture, as it goes from low to high, it's getting more windy. We'll create 3 parameters for all 3 of these. Let's not do it for that one. We're going to have a constant set to 0 for the additional WPO, but I do want access to the intensity and speed. So we'll call it wind intensity, wind speed. We don't have to keep previewing this. We'll plug it into world position offset. That is actually our wind completely finished. We could set it to a preset of 0.5 and 0.2. With the wind color amount here, we can also set it to 0.5 so we can instantly see that. Another stylized grass trick is that by creating 2 constants, we need to make sure that we're defining that the roughness is 1, because we don't want unnecessary reflections. We're also going to set the specular to 0, and this will, from what we see on camera, will allow the grass to blend into the landscape in the most beautiful way possible. What we need to do with this shader is our special normal trick. The secret is to get any vector, and we're going to set it to 0, 0, and 1 on the RGB. It means it's completely facing upward, and we're going to get a special node called two-sided sine. If we multiply them together and then plug it into the normal, we can save this. And if I'm not mistaken, this is our completed grass shader. It looks really cool. We have wind, we have opacity, we have the landscape color, the wind color, and the wind itself, or the wind color mask. So I'll go into the material instance and I'll assign it. And so far it's black and scary, and we're going to see if we can fix that right now. So what we have to do before we place our grass into the landscape is to convert our static mesh into a foliage actor. And so I can right click in the content browser and go to foliage and click static mesh foliage. I'll call it our stylized grass, or okay, we'll call it our grass foliage. I double click here and then drag that right in. We don't really have to do anything in that heap of settings because we can deal with it by dragging the static mesh foliage. I'm gonna click the check mark, click on it, and I have a hunch that it might be a little small. So I'm gonna go to the scale uniform and take it from 3 to 5, and let's see what it looks like when we start painting with a density of around 300. Okay, so I'm painting the foliage in the landscape, and the first thing we'll notice is that it is pitch black. And without having even debugged anything, I think I have a hunch as to what has happened. I believe we set everything up correctly, but I'm going to click on edit and go to project settings. And in all settings, I'm going to click virtual textures. And would you look at that? By default, virtual texture support is not enabled. So it looks like I'm gonna have to see you in just a second and we'll restart. Okay, we're back and I'm gonna start painting the foliage. And as you can see, I think it's inheriting the colors of the landscape pretty darn well. I'm noticing that our grass still has some shadows that kind of break up the stylization effect I intended. So I'm going to go into the foliage settings itself, and I see that there are shadow options. So I'm just going to make sure all of these are off, including effect, dynamic indirect lighting, including cast shadow. And wow, I guess I didn't get a drum roll, but we are there. Our grass is totally working. So let's fill this out really quick and see if we could fine tune our material instance quickly after. As a final touch, I'm using the reapply tool in the foliage menu to redefine the scaling from 0.5 to 1 so that the edges of the path can have smaller grass. As I'm looking down, it's all cool, but I'm going to make sure I go into our material instance and start changing some things up, such as the speed of this wind. Let's do 0.05 or 0.01. For the opacity, I'm going to set it pretty low now. I'll go into my wind speed and intensity and actually bring it up a little bit so that we can see that it's quite a windy day. To be honest, I think our landscape is looking pretty sweet. All we could really do is take our directional light and start making it a little bit more dramatic. You get a lot of fluffiness when you start seeing the light and shadows interact with each other. The best thing to complement a nice stylized landscape is typically just a simple, friendly sphere. And we could see that even though ray traced shadows aren't on and cast shadows aren't on, you can still see that the shadows of other objects affect the grass and give us a nice, fluffy look. And so hopefully within this tutorial, you've learned a lot about some of the artistic fundamentals you might need when approaching something like this, a lot of the technical art skills that you need in a couple different softwares to be able to execute it. But I think seeing it all in one video, hopefully with the sound of my annoying voice, helped you get through it. Utilizing these skills together as an environment artist, especially a junior, will allow your portfolio to grow at a more exponential rate. By having a foundation of skills in shaders, materials, and different softwares, you're going to be able to create really amazing art in Unreal and express yourself in ways that you didn't think was possible. We kind of broke the rules by turning off ray tracing, using these weird noises, and having really cartoony grass, and at the end of the day, it blends in with the environment really well, and we can take it a lot further from here. So if you enjoyed what you saw, make sure to subscribe to both Fast Track Tutorials and me because we got an awesome course coming out. If you like my style, you're going to have a lot of fun with it. And check out my channel as well because I love to do everything stylized and hopefully we can learn a lot together. Anyways, guys, have a fantastic one. And again, thank you for watching Fast Track Tutorials.